whatever he says and however much he tries to get us to pay attention to his latest outrageous comments, there's still the price of eggs, there's still the price of bread, there's still the price of your health insurance or your house that you can't afford.
People are struggling with affordability, and telling them that everything is fine doesn't change what they feel when they go into the supermarket. Hello and welcome to TrumpWorld. I'm Anushka in merry DC.
And I'm Matt in very merry Leeds, where I'm busy today. Yeah, you love Leeds. Isn't it where you're from?
I love Leeds. No, I'm from Manchester.
Okay, all right.
And actually, I used to sing a song when I was a child about how much we hated Leeds Football Club. But that's for another podcast.
A completely different one, yeah. Anyway, so how's it been? Are you getting into the Christmas spirit at all?
Yeah, they really do Christmas well here, don't they? In the
big baubles.
US, as soon as Thanksgiving is over, we're in big time. And I went to a lovely carol service, medieval carols, at the Willard Hotel
niche
last night. Bit niche, but my friend was in the choir. She had a beautiful voice. Nevertheless, there were loads of journalists there. There were lots of, DC types discussing. What can you imagine we were discussing? We were discussing Donald Trump, the national security strategy, and whether we have reached peak Trump. Do you like that word? Do you think
I love it, yes.
Trump?
We've used it a few times. In fact, I think I've used it over the years now and again when you've said something that was really peak, as my daughters would call it. We thought, have we reached peak Trump? But he gets away with it over and over again. But of course, the numbers haven't been stacking up in his direction at all, partly because of the economy, partly because he doesn't seem to be acknowledging, these problems. And we'll be talking about all that to John Podesta. He's the former chief of staff of one Bill Clinton. He was also running Hillary Clinton's campaign when she was trying to be president and was defeated by Donald Trump. He had to break the news to her that night that she wasn't going to win. He said that was the most painful night of his entire life, understandably. But we'll get his perspective on all this, which is really fascinating. But I think there are some things happening inside the MAGA camp and inside, the Trump White House that are not, exactly going to fill those big, shiny baubles that Melania so hates with any Christmas cheer. What are those things, Anushka?
Well, yeah, what is the theory on this? The point at which people started talking about whether we could have hit peak Trump was basically when there were those elections, including Zohran Mamdani in New York that we talked about, and it looked like the Democrats were doing quite well. So what has happened since then, which has made me think this is looking more and more likely? Well, one of those things is that there have been splits in MAGA, and we're going to talk about that. Marjorie Taylor Greene with another interview this week. The second is about affordability. I really sat up and took notice the moment I heard Donald Trump say affordability is a hoax. And now we've had a speech for him about the economy where he certainly is trying to tell the American public that it is going incredibly well.
And I have no higher priority than making America affordable again. That's what we're going to do. And again, they caused the high prices and we're bringing them down. It's a simple message. If I had one message tonight, this is being covered all over the world. This is crazy because I haven't made a speech in a little while. When you win, you say, I can now rest.
So he's got problems in MAGA. He's not very popular when it comes to the economy at the moment, and he doesn't seem to care about that. But meanwhile, he is very much pressing ahead with his agenda. And the most astonishing thing this week has been not only a national security strategy in which he really, really goes for Europe, but then really doubling down on that in an interview with Politico. Just listen to this.
I do want to go back to Europe for a moment, though, because you said they're not doing a lot of things right in your view. And just
they can't be doing right because look what's happened.
Well, your administration just released a new national security strategy that sent shockwaves throughout Europe. The strategy says a key pillar of American foreign policy should be, quote, cultivating resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations. How much should European leaders prepare for your administration to push to reshape the continent's politics?
Well, Europe is a different place.
What do you mean by that?
And if it keeps going the way it's going, Europe will not be, in my opinion, many of those countries will not be viable countries any longer. Their immigration policy is a disaster. What they're doing with immigration is a disaster. Most European nations they're decaying.
What's extraordinary about this particular clip is that Trump is articulating something that was written down in the national security strategy, this document that comes out on an annual basis that kind of defines where America is heading. And of course, that document in itself was the kind of black and white version of what J.D. Vance was telling Europe and the world back in February when he gave that jaw-dropping speech at the Munich Security Conference. And the essential takeaways, which will really spoil the Christmases of any number of European leaders, apart from Viktor Orban and Fico, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, is that essentially he's agreeing more with Vladimir Putin, or this administration is agreeing more with the values of Vladimir Putin than with the values of Europe. Essentially, it is saying, why should we really bother even supporting Zelensky in Ukraine because he's too weak to win this war? He is tearing up what have been 75 years of common values embodied both in NATO, but also helping to found the European Union. And all those European leaders who call Trump daddy, who have been kissing his ring, must be wondering to themselves, where on earth does this go? Is America now still our friend, just about, or actually our ideological foe? And the other thing that really struck me, and I'm sure it struck you as well, Anushka, is that he's interfering or trying to interfere through this document in the internal workings of European democratic politics by talking about populist parties that are challenging the establishment, by talking about civilizational threats to Europe. And I think if you're a European leader or indeed a European voter, you're going to sit up and listen and think, is this the new world order we're going to be slithering into just before Christmas 2025.
Although so far it doesn't seem to be stopping them from continuing to try to find ways to praise Trump. I was talking to a diplomat recently who was basically, I was saying, does there come a point where you actually have to say, hang on, this is not right, especially when Trump, in that Politico interview, he just sounds like he absolutely hates Volodymyr Zelensky. It is really, really quite cutting. And what the diplomat said to me is we still just look for the areas where we can say positive things. And that is what they are continuing to do. Although I do sometimes wonder when they look back on all of this, given how far that strategy goes, how much it's talking about parties across Europe. And as you say, it doesn't name the parties, but it's very, very clear who they're talking about. And they're talking about this idea of, immigration, I think, of people of colour is what they're basically saying, is changing what Europe feels like in a very, very negative way. I find it all very fascinating, and we're going to talk to John about all of that as well. I just want to ask you about MAGA splits. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene and her arguments with Donald Trump are not new. They've been rumbling on. She did a 60 Minutes interview with CBS over the past week, and he got very, very angry about it. How damaging do you think all of that is?
I think it's really damaging. I think Trump's power is really reliant on his ability to keep the MAGA movement united and therefore to hold the Republican Party hostage to the whims of his own power. And I think that has been fundamentally ruptured by the rebellion that started with Marjorie Taylor Greene, who, remember, was one of the most fiery pro-Trump, pro-MAGA, America First, Trump Forever people in American politics a few years ago. There's the absolute desire to see Epstein, and the Epstein network, the deep state of globalist influencers, exposed for being sexually, financially, and politically, morally corrupt. Tick that box because she managed to start a rebellion that Trump couldn't stop, and therefore we had that vote in Congress. The second thing is, MAGA, America First, do not get involved in foreign wars. The MAGA crowd did not like the war with Iran. They did not like many of them don't like America's unadulterated, undiluted support for Israel. And you're already seeing them positioning themselves for who takes over from Trump, assuming he's not going to try and run for a third term. Whether it's, Marjorie Taylor Greene trying to run for president, don't rule that one out. Tucker Carlson running for president, or indeed J.D. Vance doing what he thinks, is his, rightful succession. This is interesting, and none of these people are doing what they're doing without political calculations. And the calculation of Marjorie Taylor Greene is that the MAGA camp is split, that Trump has reached peak Trump, and that it's her term and that, the turn of her people to try and take over in some form or another.
I do also wonder if the Epstein vote that obviously you covered here in Washington, D.C., to allow me to go to Trinidad and cover
Anytime you want to go to the Caribbean, I'm very happy to be in Washington on the coalface. There's
so much news. I just need Matt to come over and help out when I want to go around the country. But was a sign, even though in the end Trump was like, okay, fine, vote to release the Epstein files, was a sign for Congress, and the first sign I think we've seen that actually they don't have to do every single thing that Donald Trump says.
It's an open defiance of his power, and I think it really hurt him, and it'll hurt him in the next year. So I mean, obviously, so he's got problems inside the MAGA camp. That's looking much more frayed than it has done probably ever. But his real issue will be with with affordability and ordinary American voters, whether they're Republicans or Democrats or independents, thinking this isn't going according to what he promised us in the last election.
Yeah, I mean, he's given himself an A+++ on the economy.
Only.
I think what he fails to realise, and look, Biden made the same mistake. Look, the economy's going great. You're all right. Is that, we, the public, don't think about prices through economics. I mean, it may well be true, it is true, that inflation is nothing like it was at the peak of inflation in 2022 when it was over 9%. I think it's down more like 3%. But inflation is prices going up. So it is still the case that some of the prices we're talking about, I think, if you think about food, for instance, are 18% higher than they were back in 2022. And what your average person isn't thinking is, oh, look, inflation has come down while you're walking around the supermarket. You're thinking, bloody hell, eggs are really expensive right now. And you're not thinking they're cheaper than they were in 2018. And that is his problem. And also, I just wanted to look at it when he gave himself an A+++. Got my notes here. So I'm just going to peer at my notes, my scrawled, very messy
numbers.
Notes.
I can see numbers too, real numbers.
I won't go into too much detail, but I just had a look through some of it to see that. So, and some polling as well, which is really interesting. On food, almost half of Americans think that groceries are more expensive than they were a year ago. Yes, inflation has eased down to 2.7% in September. But as I said, 18% higher in terms of prices than they were in 2022. Housing. 3/4 of Americans think that housing is becoming less affordable, and the income you need to be on to be able to afford an average home is $121,400.
Wow. That's $100,000 almost. Yeah.
The average is 84,000. I'm assuming that's household figures. And then there's health insurance. And I think Donald Trump has got a problem in health insurance because premiums have been going up. At the end of the shutdown, they didn't do a deal about premiums that are going to affect low and middle income workers. His big, beautiful bill, which he talks very proudly of, could actually make some of his key voters have to pay more when it comes to health insurance. So I think it is all very well for politicians. And by the way, I do not think that this is a Trump problem or a Republican problem. I think this is politicians the world over problem, which is that people are struggling with affordability, and telling them that everything is fine doesn't change what they feel when they go into the supermarket.
Impressed by the number crunching, Anushka, but also you've been on a trip to Minnesota, to Minneapolis more precisely. Tell us about that trip and what you discovered.
Yeah, last week on TrumpWorld, we were discussing comments that Donald Trump had made about Somalis, basically saying that they'd ruined the state of Minnesota. He specifically talks about a very big fraud case that was going on there, but he used it to basically attack all Somalis. It's the biggest population of Somali Americans are in Minnesota, particularly in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. He said people should basically go home and fix their own.
Shocking language, wasn't it? I mean, even under the,
really,
given what he said before, this was appalling.
And the vast majority of Somali Americans in Minnesota are Americans. They are US citizens. More than half of them were born there. I was really shocked by what I heard. I met someone who was running a restaurant. They'd had 6 death threats since Donald Trump's words. So directly linked to that, telling them to go home. I was there when one of them was being called in. Some of them sounded like they were AI, others did not. And it was just really, really horrifying. Interestingly, there were Somalis there who had voted for Trump. And when I was going around and talking to people, in a Somali mall, the footfall was very, very low. I mean, they partly thought because they've intensified ICE immigration raids there, so people are scared to come out, even though they are US citizens. And, just on the issue of affordability, that's what people were talking about. They were like, he's attacking us, but all we care about is that we just can't afford right now to, buy our weekly groceries in the ways that we used to be able to.
But this is also very Trump, isn't it? He likes to change the conversation away from things that he finds uncomfortable, like Epstein or like affordability. His genius for getting us to pay attention to whatever he said, is remarkable. But I just wonder whether he's reached the limits of that, because whatever he says and however much he tries to get us to pay attention to his latest outrageous comments, there's still the price of eggs, there's still the price of bread, there's still the price of your health insurance or your house that you can't afford. They won't go away. And at some stage, people just get tired of all that Trump noise coming out of the White House. And what they wanted to focus on is fixing stuff.
So, yeah, and the Democrats need an answer to all of that. So let's talk to someone who knows that party inside out. John Podesta was chief of staff to Bill Clinton. He ran Hillary Clinton's unsuccessful 2016 campaign. He's now chair of a really big progressive think tank here in the US, the Center for American Progress. And here is our conversation with him. Welcome, John. Thank you for joining us. Can we start with Donald Trump? Do you think his popularity has shifted?
Well, I think you see that in the polls. His popularity has definitely shifted. Whether that affects his governing style is a different question. But he's dropped down into the low 40s, and most of the, when you add up all the polls, and most of the most reliable aggregators have him someplace around 41, some at 39. So that's a far cry from where he was in January when he came into office. It's about as low as he was in his first term, with the exception of right after the insurrection on January 6th. So definitely people are, he's lost a lot of the voters that he pulled back to his column in 2024. As I note, that doesn't seem to have affected him very much in terms of what he's doing in office.
I mean, he seems to be doubling down what he thinks is his enormous economic success, even though the numbers are pointing in a different direction. What do you think is going on there?
It's it's actually hard to know. It's ideology over analysis for sure. I mean, the public is screaming at him that they're concerned about affordability, the cost of living, the rise in prices. Today's in Pennsylvania, trying to argue that he's bringing prices down. The public knows that's not true. We've seen, for example, electricity prices during his first year in office rise by 13% after he promised to cut them in half while he was in office. Prices of groceries are up. Prices of housing are up. So I think people are very pressured by the cost of living, and he's everything he's doing really pushes in the opposite direction, starting from his early adventures into tariffing products from countries, and particularly in a sort of whimsical, idiosyncratic way. It's chaotic, but it's pushing prices up, and people know it. And I think one of his least popular policies is the increase in costs that's resulted from those tariffs. But really across the board, if you look, for example, the place where I've spent most of my time in the last couple of years on the clean energy front, he's killed a huge number of projects, lost 158,000 jobs and counting, and canceled projects that could have powered 12 million homes. So he's doing everything he can to push prices up rather than take them down. I'm not a pollster, but if I read the pollsters and listen to them, what they're predicting is he's got some ways to go down unless he course corrects. But I don't see anything that indicates that that he's either self-reflective or that he's going to change direction.
We've been discussing this idea of have we reached peak Trump on the idea of his approval ratings. And I mean, even if we have, the numbers you're talking about, still a lot of people who are supporting him. And in many ways, doesn't matter because he doesn't have to unless he changes the constitution. We're not really expecting him to run for the next election. And yet he still has 3 more years in power. What does he want to do? How do you think he wants to reshape America? And can he do it in that time?
Well, look, I think he's blended his domestic policy now with international policy through this new national security strategy. It's kind of ethno-nationalism, embrace of authoritarianism, abandon your allies, embrace your peer competitors, and if you read that national security strategy, it's of a piece with what he's doing domestically. He feels like there's no limits to what he can do in terms of the use of the military on the ground in the United States in terms of deployment into our cities or across the Western Hemisphere. So he's making the national security strategy one might describe as MAGA for the world, but it's based in a vision of a strongman leadership, authoritarianism, crony capitalism, cut deals where you can, enrich yourself where you can, and let others do it as well. So the fact that he is the chapter on Europe, I think, is certainly chilling, given the.
You can say that again.
Given the past decades of alliance that we've had and the signaling that is going on that they're prepared to abandon NATO. He's worried about civilization erasure in Europe. I'm worried about civilization erasure in the U.S. The loss of constitutional norms, the lack of checks and balances. But I think it stems from a worldview that these right-wing populist authoritarian regimes are his kindred spirits, and that he can create a world where they're all rowing in the same direction. I think you don't need to know much more than or hear much more than the comment of Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, who said the adjustments we're seeing are largely consistent with our vision.
Which is an extraordinary thing.
So that's the chief Kremlin spokesman.
What a compliment.
The U.S. national security strategy is consistent with the vision of the Kremlin.
But I just wonder whether we should be that surprised by the NSS, the National Security Strategy document, because this is the kind of stuff that Trump has been, or some of it, Trump has been saying for years. I mean, he started his political career virtually loathing the European Union as, a bunch of, freeloading cheaters. He's been, repeating that over and over again. He's hated Zelensky ever since he had that first phone call with him, as far as we can tell. And, if you look at what Vance was saying in Munich back in February, which had everyone ashen-faced and gasping, if you look at what Trump has been saying more or less consistently, it's all in that document, black and white. I wonder whether the difference is that it's actually written down in a slightly colloquial style, almost as if whoever wrote it was channeling Trump. And I just wonder whether that's the big difference here, is that this is the doctrine.
I would say two things, Matt, in response to that. One is, it's very different than Trump 1, where, I think people were surprised at how much he leaned into adopting a theory of great power competition, seeing Russia and China as challenges, that they were challenging America's power, influence, and interests in the world. We've done a 180 from the position of Trump 1. I think it is more consistent with, as you noted, Trump, Vice President Vance's Munich speech. Very consistent with that. Their refocus on the Western Hemisphere as a zone with the Trump corollary that they can do absolutely anything they want, including actions, including extrajudicial killings that are almost certainly illegal. The second tap that has been debated up on Capitol Hill now, almost certainly illegal, is they've given themselves free rein to do whatever they want, whenever they want. And as I said, I think it's consistent with his sense as a strong man that he can use the military any way he wants to, including in domestic law enforcement and sending federalizing National Guard troops and sending them into cities across the country.
It's interesting that Matt says, in a way, he wasn't surprised by it. I mean, in many ways, maybe because he was covering Trump 1.0. I was in the UK watching it from afar. But I just want to ask you about the question of race, because that strategy actually had my jaw on the floor. Last week, we talked about the comments that Donald Trump had made about Somalis, and I jumped on a plane to Minneapolis and very, very quickly found a Somali restaurant owner who had literally received 6 death threats in a day and a half, telling her to go home, telling her that they were going to kill her kids and her family. I mean, really, really horrifying stuff. And she was saying to me, you know, he said he wanted the good immigrants from Denmark and Switzerland, but he doesn't want the bad immigrants from Somalia or Haiti. You know, it's very clearly to this woman about race. And, you know, I listened to him in an interview this week talking about the London mayor, and he said they've got a mayor called Khan. And that is the thing that seems to really stick to him. And then this document drops, which appears to be, you know, arguing the great replacement theory to some extent. Yeah. And the worry about Europe, which actually it frustrates me when people interview him that no one actually gets to the point here, which is the worry is the number of, you know, people of colour who are moving into Europe. I mean, he might argue it's about development rather than that. But how much? I mean, you've seen governments for many years. How shocking is that? And how much is it driven by race, in your opinion?
Well, I think the whole argument around civilization erasure and Europe in this document is a race-based argument. They've made a lot of hay out of attacking the kind of woke left on DEI. They're race obsessed, I think. It's demonstrated, I think, both in domestic affairs, but now very blatantly in this international national security strategy. Look, it's not different than what we saw Putin pursue in Russia. It's really of a kind. And it's a, ethno-nationalist agenda. Orban does the same thing in Hungary. It's kind of, but at its heart, it is a view that I think the person you interviewed is right to reflect on. I think it is. There's a significant amount. Go back to Trump's coming down the staircase.
Well, that's what I meant. It started
in 2015.
With that, yeah.
I mean, this all began there, and I think
the birther campaign.
It will end badly for the country and for the world. But you know, unless the what we were talking about at the beginning of this discussion, the American people finally kind of reject what he's peddling.
But you know, we've been there many times. You know, he said some outrageous things in the past, and his, you know, the whole start of his campaign in 2015 when he came down that escalator in Trump Tower was outrageous. The birther campaign against Obama was outrageous, and yet every time we think that he's overstepped the line of what is reasonable, he gets, you know, he's not punished for it in the polls. But I want to ask you just getting back to what you said about Europe and his particular loathing, you know, of the European Union and what it represents, but, you know, both as a kind of community of values, but also as a potential competitor for the United States. When you've got the British Prime Minister, the French President, the German Chancellor going out of their way to kiss his ring, even though he's basically torn up everything that they thought they could rely on and has trodden all over their value system. If you were still chief of staff to a president, obviously not this one, what advice would you give those European leaders? Because Trump, on one hand, he says, I hate people who suck up to me, but he kind of expects it as well. And they're told, so what would you say to them? How should they deal with him?
Well, look, I think you're seeing it not just in Europe, but Mark Carney in Canada, others across the globe. I think there's a certain sense in which they have to deal with him, and they've kind of got his number in terms of the fact that, you know, the more gold they can carry into the Oval Office to hand him as a present, the more he's literally, yeah.
In the case of Switzerland, it was literally a gold bar. And it worked, by the way. It worked, John.
That buys them a little bit of peace. But I think they have to, I think that, you know, bullies tend to keep going unless you push back. And at some point, you just have to recalibrate and decide that I need a strategy that doesn't rely on what was, again, for decades and decades, a reliable partner in the United States, which I think is obviously horribly regrettable. But I think you've got to basically be prepared to, try to stay out of his gun sights, but be prepared to move forward with your own strategy, because you can't accept.
But do you think it was a mistake? I mean, I noticed him again this week quoting Mark Rutte, calling him daddy. Do you think it was a mistake? I mean, Keir Starmer, the planning that went into Keir Starmer's visit here, the letter from the King, the attempt to make him feel special, was that right or wrong?
Probably worth a try, but I think when he's asking you to fundamentally, when the price gets so high that you're abandoning your values, you have to say no. And I think where we have gotten pretty close to that is with Ukraine, and so far people have pushed back sufficiently that we'll see where that ends. But I think the original U.S. plan, had he forced our European partners to go along with that, would have been disastrous for Ukraine and probably disastrous for European security.
I mean, I guess the question we're circling around is whether under Trump 2.0, the republic, the greatest Republican, experiment in the history of mankind is failing, is becoming something different, and whether the alliance that was started by this republic after the Second World War, embodied in NATO, but also the European Union, would not exist if America hadn't provided the security for Europe. If that is all gone, whether Trump, is succeeded by J.D. Vance or by Tucker Carlson or whoever, right? Has America shifted fundamentally? Or do you think that Bill Clinton's old statement that everything that is wrong with America can be righted by everything that is right with America still holds water?
Look, I think Joe Biden tried that strategy, thought like this was an aberration, a one-term thing. And that proved not to be true, that there was a strain in in American politics that people felt like they had been kind of abandoned by the people who were in power, whether Democrats or Republicans, that they were willing to try some different things. That was particularly true in terms of if you think about who shifted in the election, that shift amongst young people, particularly young people of color, just like, I think they thought like nothing's working, let's just give something else a try. But now they see what the results of that are, so they could shift back. But I think it's, you can't just chalk this off as a complete aberration, a one-time election, Russian interference, whatever. It has to be viewed as part of the American body politic.
Can I just, on the foreign policy point, on Russia, I mean, isn't there a democratic failure here as well? Wasn't there a kind of failure to act in 2014 by Barack Obama that perhaps allowed us to move towards this position? And could more have been done on Russia before we got to this point?
Before you answer that, can I just add one thing? I remember listening to the foreign policy debate between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama in 2012. And George Stephanopoulos asked them what the biggest foreign policy challenge was. And Mitt Romney said, it's Russia. And Obama almost laughed in his face. And I know this was 2 years before Crimea, but it was 4 years after the invasion of Georgia. So the problem was manifest, but not quite as manifest as it became a few years later. So I'm basically repeating Anushka's question with that little point added. Do you think that the Democrats, missed a trick there?
Yeah, I don't think there's. I think there's no question. Well, you're asking two somewhat different questions. One is, did they miss a beat in terms of the threat of Russia as a regional player, viewing it as, essentially a somewhat failed state with a bunch of nuclear weapons? Maybe that goes back to the view.
A petrol station with nukes, I think, was the insult leveled against them.
People underestimated the potential for Putin to gather power and to exercise it in ways that were detrimental to certainly to European security, but to global security. And then the second question is, did the Obama administration miss a beat on the Russian interference in the 2016 election? In that context, you're preaching to the choir because, as you know, I chaired Hillary's campaign, and we were screaming about this. The press did not take it seriously at all. They thought we were just whining. But indeed, I think the efforts, particularly in social media, to influence the election where it counted, were a significant factor in the 2016 election.
Do you think she would have won without the Russian interference?
It's hard to pull any thread out of the fabric, but I think when the votes are different by 10,000 in Wisconsin and 20,000 in Michigan and 40,000 in Pennsylvania, that's not a lot of votes.
You were at the sharp end of a lot of that, personally. I mean, obviously, I do want to talk about what was that like? How do you reflect on it now?
He didn't want to talk about it at all.
I just, I learned to be to feel no pain.
Did you? Did you have to become really thick-skinned?
Yeah.
Can we just remind you of your pain at the time? So sorry to be, we don't want to be cruel here. This is a kind podcast. But because I remember I heard you talking a little bit about this to David Axelrod, who had your job in the Obama administration, the job that you had in the Clinton administration. Just talk us through that night, because, I covered the 2016 election. Everyone's jaws, I think, including Trump's probably, were on the floor. What was that night like for you? And what was it like having to break the news to Hillary that she was going to lose?
Look, I think the ebb and flow of the campaign was, we felt we were up. You covered it. We had a lead that we thought was relatively steady 15 days out or so. Jim Comey drops the bomb. It's always fascinated me that Trump has it in so much for Jim Comey that he'd sig his prosecutors on him and indict him after the career prosecutors say there's nothing to indict.
No good deed goes unpunished.
Because no one helped him get elected president, including Steve Bannon, more than Jim Comey. But be that as it may, life is ironic, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, we thought we that took us into a little bit of a downward spiral. We came out by the end, after he decided there was nothing to see here, 10 days later, that we thought we were going in. I was, at least, and I think the rest of the senior team were nervous about it, about the election, but we thought we were going to win. And then when we saw the results coming in, it was heartbreaking. And I was in this. You noted. I think I was probably the person who said, "I don't think we're. I think we're going to lose," to her, and that was, she's a very tough person and very determined, and was, sort of gathered herself and gave really an amazing speech the following morning about what this means for the country. But it was. you don't have those kind of losses very often in your life, and I don't want to ever have another one again.
I speak to a lot of Democrats about what do you do next, and a couple really surprised me by basically saying never can we have a woman because a woman can't win. I mean, obviously there are huge things that we can talk about, including you mentioned the bits of Pennsylvania that you failed to win, and maybe that's where we need to focus to try and for the Democratic Party to win again. But do you accept what some people have said to me, that the country won't vote for a woman?
I hear that more from women than I hear from men.
I'll say the people who've said that to me are women. Yeah.
I think I think that it seems to me that that the quality of the candidate counts for a lot, and I think we have to wait and see. There's definitely, and maybe at the time in 2016, but I think if I had worked in the Harris campaign, I'd probably feel the same way. But in 2016, the mainstream press, I think, matters more than it does now. I mean, people get their sources of news from all over the place. And the mainstream press definitely had a bias, and the coverage was influenced by, on a scale that I think male candidates wouldn't have faced. I don't know if that's, I was in the White House. I wasn't really working on the campaign in 2024. I don't know if Vice President Harris felt the same way. I suspect maybe she did. But in the end of the day, it's remarkable that we now have a woman Japanese prime minister and we can't elect a president of the United States. You would think of the male-dominated cultures in the world, that would have been high on the list. So, I think eventually we'll have a woman president, but it's a high hurdle.
Can I ask you something about the curious predilection of American voters, and the political establishment for dynasties as we come up to the 250-year anniversary of you turning your back on dynastic rule in the British monarchy? And so you had the Kennedys, you had the Bushes, you had the Clintons, or the mini dynasty. First the husband, then the wife. The Trumps, if they could get away with it, would probably be the biggest bigly dynastic rule that we've ever seen. I mean, what is it about, first of all, this desire to have, the branded name of a particular family in charge of so many things? And do you think that Trump has finally overplayed that hand? Because he seems to be engaged, I'm sure he would be proud of this himself, in a kind of family enrichment exercise, which he would regard as entirely legal. But I wonder if the American public will think at the end of this, enough is enough.
Look, I think we have more of a celebrity culture. It's probably partly, stems from that. People get to know. They think they get to know people and think they can predict how they act, and then that rubs off, I think, on sort of family members.
Does the American public mind?
Oddly, I think his gilding of the White House at a time when people are struggling with the price of groceries has caused a reaction to say, boy, he really doesn't care about me. And I think that let them a cake attitude of at the Kennedy Center Honors on the ballroom, it's firing the architect because it's not big enough, putting Trump on the Institute of Peace after he tried to destroy the institution. All that I think that's actually becoming a problem for him.
It's very Louis XVI, isn't it?
If you listen to people who are out and doing qualitative research, this is now like coming up in the focus groups. The ballroom, the gilding, the gifts to him, the plane, how many people get a free 747, when they're struggling to pay their bills. And that, I think, people have noticed that, and I think that's beginning to take a toll on him.
But let's let's kind of think of that about as political strategy. And I sat there and watched Donald Trump say affordability is a hoax. And I thought, wow, that is a turning point. That is a problem. And, now he says, everything's fine in terms of the economy. And clearly what united the Zohran Mamdani win in New York with what we saw in New Jersey and what we saw in Virginia and what we've started to see elsewhere was affordability. People are clearly feeling the pinch. They don't believe it. They didn't believe it when Joe Biden said the economy's great. They don't believe it when Donald Trump says there is no such thing as inflation. But those three elections that I mentioned did ultimately have a very different tone and a very different kind of description of who they were. Two of them were very outwardly centrist. One of them was very openly socialist. I mean, interestingly, some of Zohran Mamdani's ideas don't sound wildly to the left in Europe, where lots of social democratic parties have looked at things like that. But what is the answer of those three, if you like, in your opinion? Where does the party need to push? Can they all exist? And was the party wrong? Was Chuck Schumer wrong to not endorse Mamdani?
Yeah, I think that was a mistake. And I don't know. I mean, I guess I understand the pressures on him. New York elite were all freaked out by him. But he had clearly tapped a vein in New York City. I think what they share is not only their focus on affordability, but they were out there and perceived to be listening to the people and responding to their concerns. And they were all three. And if you could extend this to the, even these down ballot races like the public utility commissioners in Georgia, which surprisingly elected two Democrats on the affordability issue. They were listening to people. They were responding to their concerns. They were relatively practical including Mamdani in the approach that he took. There's nothing super radical about free buses. Mike Bloomberg proposed it when he was mayor of New York, and trying to get the cost of housing down where it's very significant burden on people in the city.
So you don't think he's that radical?
Well, I think we'll see how he governs, but I think I think you could look at what he ran on when he ran for the state assembly, or you could look at what he ran on when he was running for mayor. What he was running on bread and butter issues when he ran for mayor. And I think he connected with people. He was a wizard on social media, but people just sensed that he was out there with them. And I think that was the biggest rap against Cuomo, which is that he was kind of tone deaf to the pain that people were feeling on the street.
And that he'd been rejected, and he came back. There was a kind of, there's a kind of like entitlement to this idea that you can come back.
Exactly. But I think that he wasn't, if Trump could come back, I can come back. But I think it was more that, particularly in the early days before the primary, he didn't get out and campaign amongst the people, and they sensed that. And I think if you look at Spamberger or you look at Mikey Sherrill, they're out with people on the street, listening, responding, and right dead set on the issues that the public was saying you got to pay attention to.
Was he right to go to the White House?
Yes. I thought I wouldn't have expected it, but it was a brilliant move. And I think, unlike some, I think it was an interesting because it in some ways, I suppose it worked for both of them. Trump's pretty good at drawing the camera to him. And, Mamdani knew that if he went there, that there was going to be an upside potential to Trump basically saying, yeah, we're all buddies here. You know, Trump has a habit of doing that when you're civil with him and then he thinks you're his best friend and whatever. But Trump was also, I think, trying to take the energy of what had happened in the campaign and bring it back to himself and actually, you know, be in that sort of media glow, if you will. And he did that. And probably it was like weirdly worked for both of them. But I think what the mayor got out of it, or the mayor-elect got out of it, was you won't see, you know, National Guard troop in New York anytime soon.
John, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. That was a real pleasure.
Thank you, John. That was really, really fascinating.
Talking to John Podesta reminded me of an interview I did with Bill Clinton once, and I did ask him at the end of the interview about Monica Lewinsky, even though we were in Haiti covering the earthquake at the time, and he went absolutely puce and then mad. I mean, he was about to tear my throat out. He was so angry that I brought up the subject. But of course, John Podesta, who was there at the time, who tried to steer the White House through this extraordinary scandal, he would have so much more to say about that if we were to get him back into a room, which I'm sure we can at any time. But anyway, fascinating guy, great insight. I didn't really think he had that many convincing answers about how the Democrats should play the midterm elections or the next presidential one, because that is still a very live debate within the Democratic camp, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And you know, whatever they say, these are clearly very different things going on at the moment in New York and in other parts of the country. I did think it was interesting that he was basically saying what politicians need to do is look like they are getting out there and they are listening to people, and finding ways to achieve that is clearly, you know, something you can do whatever part of the Democratic Party you are in. And obviously what happens in 2026 with the midterms and how they respond to that, and then how they respond in 2028 when it is the presidentials, and they really need to find a single voice as a party to try to reach out to the country, is quite different.
John Podesta said people have to listen to the voters. Well, we're listening to the people who listen to our podcast by taking your comments on board. Here's one after the last one. The funniest thing in this podcast was two Brits criticizing American food. Fish and chips, mate. Let me tell you, my friend, fish and chips is one of the most underestimated culinary greats, of any kitchen, especially when they're wrapped in a tabloid newspaper, with lots of vinegar and salt. No, listen, I mean, I don't think we in Britain can really take on the United States when it comes to culinary prowess. I mean, or whatever. I mean, it's a bit of a hodgepodge, isn't it?
I don't think we were really criticising American
we weren't.
food, but maybe another time we'll do.
No, actually, I was defending it. You were criticising it. I was defending marshmallows on top of sweet potatoes, and you thought that was disgusting.
I won't tell you who, but there's a long-standing senior journalist based in Washington, D.C., who has come here from the UK, very much now living the American life, been here for a decade or more, who was saying the one thing they just can't deal with is that you cannot get decent fish and chips here in Washington, D.C. So once a year, they return to the UK, and that's the first thing they do.
With mushy peas? Where do you stand on mushy peas?
I love mushy peas.
You just said,
I love mushy peas.
Yeah, okay.
Now,
enough of that mush.
Whether you agree or disagree, please do keep sending your comments in on the politics as well, and we will respond to them. And please do hit subscribe or follow wherever you are watching or listening to us, because it does really, really help us out.
It does. And we listen, even while we chew our fish and chips and our mushy peas. Thank you very much indeed to all of you. That's it for this edition of Trump World.
See you next week.